In the cool desert night of July 2001 in Phoenix, 20-year-old Emily Carter left a friend's backyard barbecue and promised her parents she'd be home within 10 minutes. She borrowed a neighbor's red pickup, waved, and vanished. For 21 years her family lived with a porch light left on and a bedroom left untouched. In 2022, after a rare spring storm drained an old irrigation canal, a rusted red pickup rose from the mud with skeletal remains in the driver's seat and a broken necklace engraved with an initial tied to Emily's family. Modern DNA pointed to Michael Reynolds, the polite neighbor who fixed cars for free, brought casseroles, stood at candlelight vigils, and volunteered in the original search. The community was stunned. A man who wore neighborly kindness like armor had apparently hidden something far darker. Detectives reopened the file, re-interviewed witnesses, matched tire tracks and microscopic fibers, and eventually built a case that led to arrest, trial, and a verdict that forced a small city to reckon with how easily trust can obscure danger.
Killers. Conspiracy.
We have to make sure no one sees us. Don't worry, it's all taken care of.
Betrayal. Cold-blooded murder. Stay with us as we dive deep into this chilling, mind-disturbing true crime story. And before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to Cold Case, True Crime Stories, for more chilling true crime documentaries.
The porch light was a yellowed globe mounted on a bent post, the kind of fixture you don't notice until it isn't there. For the Carter family it had become ritual, an incandescent beacon that cut through the hot July nights like a promise. On July 14, 2001, as cicadas droned in the dry mesquite and the air sat heavy over Phoenix's quiet neighborhoods, Rebecca Carter sat by the window with the curtains open just enough to watch the road. The light painted the yard in a warm, loyal strip. She had memorized the rhythm of the night, a neighbor walking a dog at 11 p.m., a distant stereo shifting from Latin beats to slow rock, the occasional truck rolling by. But when the familiar red pickup did not return that night, the light felt less like comfort and more like an accusation. Emily Carter was 20. She'd graduated high school the previous year, worked part-time at a local deli, and had plans to enroll in a nursing assistant program the following fall. She kept a small spiral notebook with notes about classes and future shifts, a stack of Polaroids of friends taped inside a closet, and a preference for steady, careful choices. Friends described her as practical and warm, someone who baked cookies for neighbors, who said thank you with genuine eye contact. She liked long drives along the canal road when the sky was purple with dusk. That Saturday night there was a backyard gathering 2 blocks over. String lights were hung across a low garage, voices rose and fell like a gentle tide, and people drifted between folding chairs and a portable grill. Emily said she'd be leaving early. She hugged her mother, promised to come home, and accepted a favor from a cousin who offered his red pickup because Emily's own car had a burned-out headlamp. "I'll be home before you miss me," she joked. Her mother smiled, said okay, and watched her daughter cross the yard toward the truck. After midnight, when the porch light dimmed from a dull to a steady glow, Rebecca told herself not to panic. She had been the kind of mother who trusted her children to make reasonable choices. Curfews meant safety but not oppression. At 12:45 a.m., the porch light still lit, her smile thinned into an anxious line. By 1:20 a.m., the kind of worry that sticks like sand in a shoe settled in her chest. She called the number Emily often used. It rang. No answer. She rang the cousin's phone. It went straight to voicemail. Her husband, Aaron, shuffled through the garage and checked tools as if tasks could distract him from the empty seat at the table. By 2 a.m., Rebecca dialed the sheriff's dispatch. The hysteria that sometimes greets late parent calls did not emerge. The dispatcher listened, note-taking calm. "We'll put patrols on it and get some volunteers to check the route," was the clinical reply. Within an hour, the Cucamonga County Sheriff's Office activated search procedures. In a city where hot summer nights fester with possibility, the first 48 hours were critical. The sheriff's team mobilized helicopters to sweep over the surrounding desert wash. K-9 units were placed along the canal banks, and deputies canvassed neighborhood houses. Police methods were standard but urgent. They began with a timeline: Emily's last confirmed sighting at the party, the person who had loaned the pickup, expected route back to her street, estimated times of arrival. They took statements right away: friends who may have spoken to her inside the garage, the cousin who lent the truck, the party host who remembered the last time they saw Emily. Detectives sketched a route map, marking alleyways, side roads, and the irrigation canal that ran near the neighborhood, a canal that, for years, had been both a community asset and a hazard, a man-made waterway that gathered algae and rumor alike. Search grids were set up in the usual fashion, line searches spaced at 2 to 3 meter intervals stretching from the party's parking lot toward the canal. Divers were called to clear the deeper lily-choked sections. The sheriff's office issued missing person flyers with Emily's photograph, brown hair pulled back, a small scar near an eyebrow, a soft smile. Volunteers in bright vests formed human chains along embankments while neighbors handed out cold water and sandwiches. The town that had once folded itself into routine now moved like a single organism toward panic. Investigators took photographs, recorded locations of potential evidence, and cataloged witness statements. That early investigative work drew 3 small but significant items: a single white sandal half buried near the canal bank, a cigarette but carefully collected from beside the party's trash bin, and a set of tire tracks in the soft shoulder by a dirt service road, showing a sharp braking pattern that contradicted a smooth slide into the water. Each item was photographed, measured, and sealed as evidence. The small sandal suggested someone had been at the bank on foot. The tracks suggested a vehicle had made an abrupt move. The cigarette could have been irrelevant, or not. Investigators knew that minor traces sometimes become the threads that unspool a whole case. At first, suspicion centered on the usual places: acquaintances, exes, and anyone with a motive. An ex-boyfriend, dismissed as a suspect after surveillance footage placed him at his job that night, was cleared. Coworkers were interviewed. Nothing firm emerged. Family members, understandably, were asked the inevitable emotional questions: had anyone been threatening Emily? Had she argued with anyone lately? Those conversations were intrusive and thin on return. A few disagreements over money, garden variety teen drama, but nothing that would explain disappearance. As the search extended into weeks, hope thinned into ritual. Weekly vigils started where neighbors and friends lit candles outside the Carter home, their flickering flames reflected in the wet silver of the porch glass. Emily's bedroom remained untouched, clothes folded, a diary under a bed, school brochures on the desk. The sheriff's office scaled back large-scope searches to focus on targeted follow-ups. Cases like these are depressing by design. Manpower is finite, evidence grows colder, and human memory blurs. But for the Carters, the nightly ritual persisted. Rebecca kept the porch light on as if she could anchor Emily to the house through a bulb's glow. Aaron fixed the rocking chair that had once been Emily's perch. They wrote letters to their daughter, small things done to maintain a sense of connection. The community, at first galvanized, drifted to other preoccupations: town politics, drought reports, school fundraisers. That slow withdrawal of public interest is one of the cruelties of missing person cases. The family is left in a vacuum of attention and in the dark of ongoing procedures. Still, the initial investigation did its work, evidence was logged, relationships were mapped, and the sheriff's file thickened with reports. Case detectives made home visits, rechecked phone towers for pings and handoffs, and kept a list of credible tips. The red pickup remained missing, a small, vital absence that cut to the heart of the case. The vehicle could tell a story if it was found. Without the vehicle, investigators had to piece together a puzzle with many holes. For years the Miller case, Emily's case, remained a painful white space on the community's map. Families moved in and out, children grew up, and the porch light became a local symbol, sometimes mocked by teenagers as the ghost lamp, but for the Carters it was a tether to a truth they refused to surrender. It is in this stubborn refusal, that ritual of keeping vigil, that some cold cases find the oxygen to persist until science or chance intervenes. As we trace Emily's steps and the investigators who refuse to look away, stay with Cold Case, True Crime Stories. Subscribe now and ring the bell, because sometimes it takes a long time for evidence to speak, and you won't want to miss what comes next. The desert keeps its secrets in layers. Wind, sand, and time cover footprints and mute sounds, human attention shifts, and evidence can become, for all practical purposes, buried. But in early March 2022, Phoenix experienced an atypical spell of rain. 2 days that turned the parched ground into a patchwork of mud and slow water. When the canal that cut behind the neighborhood receded, it left a thin lacquer of black silt and, in one bend, a glint of metal. Miguel Santos, a third-generation farmer who knew every nuance of the land, was checking the irrigation banks for erosion and debris. He had an eye honed by decades of irrigation cycles and a practiced negligence for what others called oddities. If a thing looks wrong, it's worth fixing, he liked to say. He pulled up a sodden flap of muck with gloved hands and exposed a fender, pitted with rust but unmistakably red. The vehicle's silhouette emerged murkily from the muck. Miguel's heart ratcheted. He called the sheriff. Within hours county evidence tents popped up along the canal like mushrooms, and the site became a theater of the methodical. Crane operators coaxed a carcass of metal free, a red pickup whose paint clung in tears and whose doors resisted in sullen hinges. Forensic teams donned white suits and gloves, photographing every crust of sediment and labeling evidence with meticulous compliance. For decades investigators had talked about the canal as a possible resting place for Emily's red pickup. That theoretical possibility turned real as the truck's driver's side came into view and the door was gently eased. Inside, the driver's seat cradled skeletal remains. Strands of hair clung to a headrest like a fragile memory. On the floorboard, a small piece of brown fabric was entangled with sediment and a silver heart pendant, the pendant's face faintly engraved with the letter E. The lab team photographed, logged, and carefully recovered the pendant in a sterile kit. To Rebecca Carter, who had spent 2 decades imagining artifacts she might one day recover, the pendant mirrored the necklace Emily had worn, a familiar bend of metal, a small scar where it had once been knocked against a bus pole. Detective Marcus Hale was assigned to lead the cold case re-examination. Hale was 45, methodical, and known in the department for a patience that bordered on stubbornness. He assembled a cross-disciplinary team, forensic anthropologists, DNA analysts, fingerprint examiners, and veteran detectives who had worked the original 2001 file. Their first procedural move was to establish an unbroken chain of custody for every item recovered. The importance of chain of custody cannot be overstated, particularly for old cases where defense attorneys will later look for every procedural crack to press reasonable doubt. The forensic anthropologist, Dr. Elaine Park, cataloged the skeletal remains with surgeon-like precision. She recorded bone integrity, looked for signs of blunt force trauma, defensive wounds, or indications that the body had been moved. She saw evidence consistent with prolonged submersion, a calcified residue in joint spaces, mineral staining consistent with years submerged in brackish canal water, but no immediate signs of defensive injuries that could be read plainly in the preserved bone. Bone tells stories, but sometimes they're fragmentary. Dr. Park's careful notes would later be bolstered by DNA extraction and microscopic analysis. The lab's initial breakthrough came from a small patch on the brown fabric that, under UV light, reacted in a way consistent with dried blood. The DNA lab used advanced extraction methods optimized for degraded samples, magnetic bead-based extraction followed by next-generation sequencing, to salvage what geneticists call low-quantity, degraded DNA. The technicians treated the sample in cleanroom conditions, ran multiple replicates, and employed negative controls to ensure there was no contamination. When profiles emerged, they were telling. Mitochondrial markers matched Emily's maternal relative samples to confirm identity in degraded remains, and the fabric held another profile, male, distinct and sufficient to produce a match in national DNA systems. That match returned to a name in the county database, Michael Reynolds, a man who had been a neighbor to the Carters in 2001, who had volunteered in the searches, and whose DNA had been collected after a 2009 misdemeanor. It was the kind of match that breaks open suspicion into actionable leads. Detective Hale knew the next steps were critical and narrow. DNA told Chaim that Michael had been in the truck at some point, but not necessarily the story of how Emily died. DNA can place a person in a location, it cannot, by itself, translate motive into murder. Hale needed context, timelines, witness statements, and physical evidence that tied a narrative together. He assigned detectives to re-interview original witnesses with modern cognitive interviewing techniques, designed to reduce suggestibility and help recover more accurate memory. Re-examining 2001 statements, the team noticed two consistent things. Michael Reynolds had been unusually present around the Carters in the months before the disappearance, offering to check the family's engine, helping with groceries, present during vigils, and various locals recalled an awkward interest he had displayed in younger women's movements. Those are the kinds of details that, alone, sound like gossip, and for legal purposes, they are often labeled habit or character evidence. But a pattern can be dangerous when accumulated. Small acts make room for opportunity. Investigators pulled phone records, pay stubs, and work logs. Not all technology from 2001 survived or was recorded. Cell phones were primitive, and tower-based location is coarse. But detectives pieced together a reconstructed timeline placing Michael's truck within a plausible radius the night Emily vanished. They compared tire tracks from the canal bank, measured and photographed in 2001, with tread patterns from his known vehicle. Forensic tire analysts looked at pattern width, lug marks, and wear patterns. A shoe print comparison expert matched partial tread impressions found near the canal to a type of work boot Michael commonly wore, though the analyst couched conclusions in probability language to avoid overstating the match. Community reactions were a complicated thing to measure. Some neighbors, who had benefited from Michael's tradesman generosity, were stunned and defensive. Others, often women who recalled uncomfortable brushes or late-night approaches that had been shrugged off in 2001, felt vindicated and unsettled. Local reporters, some of them now seasoned staff at Phoenix outlets, descended on the story with renewed interest. An old case that once faded into the archive had become, again, a headline. Editors demanded clear narratives. Who had been in the truck? Why had no one noticed then? Why had the truck disappeared? The Carters' emotions during the discovery were mixed and raw. Rebecca's quiet persistence felt both vindicated and hollow. All those years, we begged them to keep looking, she told a reporter, her voice small. We never gave up. Aaron remained stoic in public but at night replayed every small action that might have mattered, a neighbor's tool left in his driveway, a dinner shared, a borrowed flashlight. Grief in cold cases is unique. You live an extended death, a slow unspooling that punctuates anniversaries instead of immediate bereavement. The recovery of physical remains offered an odd relief, the answer to whether Emily had lived or not, but it reopened a nest of questions that would not settle easily. Detectives moved to secure search warrants. They conducted a careful sweep of Michael Reynolds' properties, seizing vehicles, clothing, and digital devices where available. They interviewed associates and checked employment logs. They also had to anticipate the defense, expect arguments about transfer DNA, claim of innocent presence in a shared social sphere, and question the integrity of two-decade-old handling of evidence. That is the legal world, one that shapes how detectives must document, test, and present scientific findings with airtight procedures. By the time the department issued a press release naming Emily's remains and reporting a male DNA match, the town's equilibrium had been smashed. Social conversations shifted, neighbors re-examined old kindnesses through the lens of suspicion, mothers admonished daughters to be cautious. A community that once assumed its own safety now confronted a continuity it could not ignore. For the investigation team, the focus moved forward, toward formal charges, forensic corroboration, and the construction of a prosecutable narrative. For the Carter family, a deeper, harder process began, to force a question with a full answer through the machinery of justice. This is the moment the science gave a name. Stay with Cold Case, True Crime Stories. Subscribe and ring the bell, and we'll follow how the detectives transform genetic whispers into an indictment that shakes a community. Detective Marcus Hale sat in a small conference room with stacks of dusty 2001 interview transcripts, file folders stamped with names, and a laptop full of newly acquired digital evidence. The room smelled faintly of coffee and file paper. Hale's work depended on patient reassembly. Everything had to be re-examined through both a modern scientific lens and a human one. For Hale, the DNA match to Michael Reynolds was the door, not the verdict. It gave him legal authority to dig deeper, to bring new forensic tests into play, and to re-interview witnesses using techniques that weren't standard 2 decades earlier. The first task in any cold case revival is to ensure that the evidence will hold up in court. Hale convened a forensics review meeting. Dr. Elaine Park, anthropology, Dr. Jorge Mendez, DNA forensics, a trace evidence specialist, and a legal liaison to ensure warrants were prepared precisely. They mapped a strategy. Forensic gains included mitochondrial confirmation of identity for the bones, advanced STR analysis from the truck's fabric, and touch DNA testing from surfaces that had escaped rigorous analysis in 2001. Forensic trace aims included fiber analysis, paint flake comparisons, and microscopic soil matching between the canal and potential storage locations where the pickup might have remained. Dr. Mendez explained the new genetic technology to the detectives in plain language. "We use targeted enrichment on degraded fragments," he said, tapping the screen. "That boosts signal for the loci we need. Degradation is messy, but with enough replication and proper negative controls, we get a clean profile." He described how statistical likelihood ratios would later be presented, explaining to Hale exactly what jurors could be guided to understand and what defense attorneys might contest. Detectives are trained to translate scientific certainty into investigative momentum. For Hale, Mendez's work was the scaffolding on which the case might rise. Parallel to lab work, Hale's team began re-interviews. Cold case interviews require a special balance. They must be careful not to contaminate witness memory with leading questions, and yet they must be direct enough to permit recollection. To do that, Hale used cognitive interviewing methods, re-established the environment, allow for open narrative, then use supportive prompts to reconstruct sensory memory, what the witness smelled, what sounds were present, the weather and street lighting that night. Memory is not a video replay, it is reconstructive. But under the right conditions, it can yield details that were previously suppressed by stress or overlooked because they seemed irrelevant then. The first re-interview was with the cousin who had loaned Emily the red pickup in 2001. In his 20s then, he'd once been a peripheral witness who'd given inconsistent times under stress. Now in his 40s with children of his own, he spoke with a voice that had weathered fatigue and responsibility. Under cordial questioning, he remembered Emily leaving the party at 11:50 p.m. and said he believed she planned to take the short route home along Oakbank Drive. He recalled Michael Reynolds' truck in the driveway across the street that evening when he'd come back from riding the party lights. Small details like the cousin's observation of the moon's angle or which songs had been playing seemed trivial until cross-referenced with other accounts. Investigators carefully logged every detail. Another re-interview yielded a key piece. A woman who worked at the deli where Emily had part-time employment admitted under the new, supportive approach that she remembered seeing Michael linger outside the shop more than once when Emily worked. At the time, she had shrugged it off as neighborly. Now, she provided a more specific description. Michael had asked Emily about what she liked to do on quiet nights, and made a small joke about late-night drives being the best for thinking. While such questions are not damning alone, they paint a behavioral pattern, a man turning his curiosity toward a younger woman in a way that made her uncomfortable, though she did not report it at the time. Hale's team also tracked legitimate, verifiable data. They subpoenaed old employment cards for Michael's hours at the local garage and found a shift that placed him in the area the night of Emily's disappearance. They obtained mechanic records to determine if Michael had repaired a vehicle recently with damage consistent with the canal tracks. Tire expert comparisons returned a high probability match between the tread impressions discovered near the canal and the pattern of Michael's work truck, though an expert witness would have to explain the associated level of certainty. Trace evidence work yielded more than DNA. Fibers collected in 2001 from the party's picnic table were retested with newer microscopy and comparison techniques. A dark synthetic fiber found on Emily's clothing in storage matched, under polarized light microscopy, fibers embedded on the pickup's passenger seat foam, an indication that Emily and the vehicle shared contact. Paint chips from the pickup's underside, collected in 2022, were tested against road salt and sediment samples from roads close to Michael's neighborhood. The microscopic soil signatures correlated in a way that suggested the truck had rested or been driven through a similar environment. The defense argument, transfer DNA and social proximity, had to be anticipated and preempted. Explaining transfer DNA to a jury is complex. Someone who sat in a truck, gave an owner a tool, or shared a handshake can leave genetic material. But the investigators had a strength: congregate pieces of evidence that point beyond innocent contact, timelines, unique fiber matches, the presence of blood consistent with an injury, and the location of the truck in a canal that was not on Emily's usual route home. The file had to read like a mosaic where each tile, while insufficient alone, builds a picture when assembled. Hale's next move was human intelligence, canvassing Michael's social circle. Interviews with acquaintances rendered an image of a man who was outwardly polite, if socially awkward, someone who fixed things for neighbors, who volunteered at church events, and who was known for offering free advice at the garage counter. Yet under the re-interview method, small accounts surfaced, late-night visits to a young woman's street, jokes that made people uncomfortable, and a reputation for persistence when a young woman declined his invitations. Those stories, combined with the lab's evidence, began to convert rumor into corroborative witness statements. At the same time, Hale and his team had to manage community fallout. Reporters wanted statements, neighbors wanted reassurance, Emily's family wanted to know everything now that the remains had been identified. Hale moved slowly and deliberately, keep the family informed with measured facts, maintain the integrity of investigatory confidentiality, and document every legal step tightly. He arranged meetings where forensic techs explained what the DNA meant and what it did not mean, tempering hopes that the identification would automatically produce a conviction. He explained that the legal system demands more than identity, it requires a narrative of events tied together by proof. As the re-interviews accumulated new details, so did the emotional weight. Rebecca Carter said she felt both furious and relieved. "I thought I'd died 1,000 times waiting," she told Hale in a quiet moment. "Now I can say her name out loud and know she's somewhere with a grave. But that doesn't make it easier." Emotional testimony is often volatile in court, and powerful. Prosecutors sometimes rely on carefully curated emotional testimony to contextualize evidence, to remind jurors that real humans sit at the fulcrum of cases. For Hale, the reconstruction effort was not simply about physical proof. It was about restoring a timeline and building a human narrative that matched the science. The investigators drafted an evidentiary path. Emily left the party. A vehicle diverted to an embankment. The red pickup ended up in the canal. Biological traces indicated a male presence and signs of a struggle, and Michael Reynolds' presence in that vehicle at a critical time was supported by multiple, convergent analytical lines. The mosaic had both scientific tesserae and human recollections, forming a depiction that could be presented to a grand jury or trial jury with clear logic. This is where the evidence starts to look like a story, one the court needs to hear. If you want to follow the arrest and trial, subscribe to Cold Case, True Crime Stories. In the next chapter, we go to the moment the investigators move from inquiry to accusation, and the town's fragile comfort shatters. Dawn in Phoenix is often unassuming, a pale gray before sun flattens the world into a palette of harsh light. On a quiet morning in April 2023, the Hale team executed a series of tactical moves that had been months in the making. Law enforcement operations rely on secrecy, coordination, and timing. They also rely on minimizing risk for everyone involved. The arrest plan for Michael Reynolds was therefore deliberate: multiple warrants, backup units, forensics teams on standby, and legal counsel ready to make an immediate affidavit to ensure the arrest would hold. Michael lived on a low-slung block of houses with a front yard of gravel and an old, palm-thin tree. At 5 a.m., unmarked cars parked quietly down the street. Officers approached the house in teams, their movements precise. A megaphone call warned, "Police. Open the door." Hushed neighbors pulled curtains. A few teens laid in bed with phones recording the rare spectacle. Michael opened the door slightly at first, then widened his eyes as officers explained the situation and informed him of the warrant. He did not bolt. He did not resist. He stood in his pajamas, flushed and baffled, as deputies read him the charge of murder decades prior. The scene was surreal for the community. Once a man of neighborhood trust, Michael stood for a moment like a statue without its context. Officers escorted him to a marked vehicle while forensic teams quietly bagged items from his home. For the neighbors who had once waved at him across the driveway, the image of a friendly face in handcuffs was a traumatic dissonance. People texted each other incredulously. At the diner, conversation stalled between sips of coffee. Social media lit up with old photos of Michael smiling at church events juxtaposed against the new image of a man in custody. The fracture between "he's a neighbor who helped" and "he's an accused killer" snapped the community into two tribes. Legal strategy pivoted into high gear. The district attorney convened a press briefing that afternoon, careful with language but firm in intent. The DA emphasized the DNA match, the chain of custody for the recovered evidence, and the multiple lines of corroboration that detectives had assembled: witness re-interviews, fiber and soil matches, and vehicle tread probabilities. The DA was careful to remind the public that the charges were allegations to be tested in court, but the press release also signaled seriousness. The case had moved from cold file to prosecution pipeline. Michael's arrest triggered a cascade of social consequences. A woman who had once worked the late shift at the deli and who had long suffered in silence now felt a brittle vindication. Another neighbor who had allowed Michael into the garage to borrow tools in 2001 sat in a coffee shop stunned, saying, "I feel awful. I thought I was helping." People who had once been cheerfully casual about his presence now replayed small memory fragments like surveillance footage, dinners he'd attended, a lingering look, an offhand comment. The post-arrest probes, however, also galvanized his defenders, people who insisted he had been a good man, a volunteer, a devoted uncle. The town divided largely along the axis of personal history and the new legal framing. Inside the jail, Michael was processed with the same clinical protocol used for any suspect. He was booked, photographed, fingerprinted, and read his Miranda rights. His demeanor was an odd, flat calm, the kind of reserve that unnerved some and suggested shock to others. Counsel was appointed. His attorney argued immediately that DNA alone did not equate to guilt. The presence of an individual's DNA in a vehicle, especially in a small town where social contact is common, does not mean he committed murder, his lawyer told reporters. He previewed defense lines, transfer DNA theories, alternative sources for the soil and fibers, and questions about how the vehicle came to rest in the canal. The prosecution, however, had been methodical. Wiring together lab reports and witness testimony, they presented a story with both scientific and human pillars. The forensics team had meticulously documented every step from recovery to testing, anticipating defense scrutiny. Dr. Mendez, the DNA analyst, was prepared to explain the lab protocols and likelihood ratios to a jury in careful, comprehensible terms. Meanwhile, Dr. Park would detail why the bone's condition suggested submersion and which marks, if any, indicated trauma. For the Carters, the arrest was both relief and surreal cruelty. Rebecca sat in her living room as the first images of Michael in custody appeared on television. She felt a taut mix of validation and sorrow. "We had his face in our home, eaten at the same table," she said later. "That thought takes my breath away." Aaron spent the week in a haze of administrative matters, meetings with prosecutors, press statements, and hundreds of family calls from people who wanted to show support. Their grief, which had been private for years, had become public. Michael's arraignment was emotionally charged and legally fraught. Supporters and opponents lined the public gallery in the courthouse. Journalists crowded the hallways. Photographers waited for a glance. The judge set bail hearings and scheduled discovery timelines. Immediately legal teams began the sparse calculus of trial preparation, the prosecution preparing witness lists and lab witnesses, the defense filing motions for evidence suppression and for more narrow interpretations of the DNA findings. Underneath the procedural bustle, the town waded through identity crises. What do you do when a neighbor you trusted becomes the accused? Community leaders tried to respond with calm. Church pastors organized prayer sessions for all involved, asking for charity and judgment until the court spoke. Neighborhood watch meetings increased, and residents started installing cameras and exchanging phone numbers more frequently. A local mother said she would teach her teenage daughter to avoid rides from anyone without signing permission at the dinner table. This is the social fallout of such a case, a reconfiguration of trust practices born from fear. At the same time, the legal fight began to sharpen. The defense filed discovery motions demanding full access to lab notes, chain of custody logs, and all exculpatory materials. Their strategy included raising reasonable doubt on transfer DNA and the integrity of 2-decade-old evidence handling. The prosecution anticipated and countered by calling independent lab auditors and offering to demonstrate the procedures in court if necessary. For a jury, this back and forth is the fulcrum where science meets skepticism. Second CTA, placed inside a tense, suspenseful moment as required, you will be shocked to know how the case progressed once the trial began and what secrets surfaced in the courtroom. Before we continue with the trial testimony and the moment the jury hears the full account, make sure you subscribe to Cold Case, True Crime Stories and turn on notifications. You don't want to miss the evidence and witness testimony that changed everything. Tension mounted in pretrial hearings. Prosecutors continued gathering corroborative evidence, cell phone towers, a newly discovered partial eyewitness account from 2001 who had not been interviewed earlier because they'd moved away, and a repair shop log that showed a potential repair to Michael's vehicle after an unaccounted night. Each discovery tightened the net and introduced new questions. Why did the truck stay hidden for decades? Who knew what and when? Could the defense provide alternate explanations for the soil matches or fiber transfers? Jurors would eventually have to weigh technical probability against human memory and decide a life's guilt or innocence. But the arrest itself had changed the community in a permanent way. For the Carters, someone had been named and taken into custody, and that had an undeniable moral weight. For Phoenix's neighborhoods, the event reconfigured conversations about neighborliness, about how goodwill can sometimes function as blinders. People who had once believed in the automatic safety of a friendly wave now paused, thinking of driveway visits and late phone calls. The shell of comfort that had cushioned many interactions cracked, revealing new responsibilities: to listen to victims, to take uncomfortable reports seriously, and to question assumptions. As court dates approached, the town braced for a spectacle, a trial that would air details, dredge through personal histories, and compute scientific certainty into legal verdict. For the investigators, the work turned from evidence collection to trialcraft, preparing witnesses to speak plainly about forensic processes and memory reliability. For the Carters, it was another step in a marathon of grief that has no natural finish line. The courtroom smelled of old wood polish, paper, and a faint trace of disinfectant. Rows of benches filled with people who had once been neighbors, co-workers, and friends. The gallery had split into color and intent, some faces bright with the conviction that justice was coming, others grim, refusing to look or speak. Emily's parents, Rebecca and Aaron Carter, sat in the front row with a small photograph of their daughter between them, brown hair in a ponytail, a soft, determined mouth. The photograph had been placed there not only as a reminder of who the case concerned but as an anchor in an environment that threatened to flatten the human into the procedural. Opening statements swung like the gates in a train yard, one side laying rails of motive and method, the other warning of thin tracks of interpretation. The prosecutor used plain language. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, projecting his voice without flourish. "What we have here is a 21-year disappearance that has come to a conclusion because of science, careful investigation, and the persistence of law enforcement. You will see how DNA, fiber analysis, and other forensic methods converge to place Michael Reynolds in the red pickup with Emily Carter on the night she vanished. You will hear witnesses corroborate his presence and behavior in the weeks and months prior. We will ask you to see the pattern." His voice was steady, not theatrical, and the room watched for a reaction. The prosecution called Dr. Jorge Mendez first, the DNA analyst responsible for the genetic work. Under oath, Mendez walked the jury through the lab's protocols with clear, careful diction. He explained next-generation sequencing and targeted enrichment in accessible terms. "We extracted DNA from a degraded blood stain on a fabric scrap recovered from the pickup's floorboard," he said, showing a photograph of the swabbed area. "We used multiple replication runs, strict negative controls, and validated amplification kits. The statistical likelihood ratio of a match to Michael Reynolds' profile over a random unrelated individual was in the millions to one. He demonstrated the chromatogram results and explained how labs interpret peak patterns, allelic dropout, and contamination controls. The prosecutor avoided jargon when possible, translating technical assertions into simple logical steps, degraded sample robust validation match with specified certainty. Cross-examination of a scientist is often where a trial grows interesting because defense counsel attempts to introduce doubt about method and process. Michael's attorney asked about contamination risk and chain of custody. Mendez conceded that degraded samples pose interpretive challenges but emphasized that the lab used replicated runs and independent confirmations from a separate accredited lab. He allowed that DNA alone is not a story of motive or timing, it merely attaches a person biologically to an object. That humility would become essential later as the jury weighed physical facts against narrative inference. Trace evidence witnesses followed. A fiber analyst described synthetic dark fibers found both in Emily's stored clothing and on the pickup's interior upholstery. Under polarized light microscopy and Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy, such fibers exhibited matching refractive indices and polymer signatures. The analyst explained transfer mechanisms, direct contact, secondary transfer, and the conditions in which fiber matches are more compelling. He testified that the combination of fiber type, distribution across multiple sites, and contextual presence, i.e., the fiber was embedded in seat foam, increased its evidentiary value beyond casual transfer. The defense questioned whether fibers could have transferred during community events where seating overlapped. The prosecutor countered that the pattern and embedding suggested intimate contact, not casual overlap. The anthropologist, Dr. Elaine Park, testified about the bones and signs of submersion and degradation consistent with long immersion. She walked jurors through taphonomy, how bodies decompose in different environments, and explained that while bone can show trauma, many soft tissue injuries do not preserve. She was careful to delineate between injuries that could be clearly identified in bone and those that could not, resisting sensationalist inferences. What the bones do show is long-term exposure to water and mineral deposition consistent with being submerged for years, she told the court. The prosecutor used that testimony to explain why the recovery in the canal meant the remains had been preserved in a way that eventually allowed for mitochondrial conformation. Witness testimony brought human texture into the lab's sterile world. A former deli coworker, under the veneer of ordinary memory, described Emily as a young woman who liked routine, and then described Michael's presence around the workplace as an annoyance that had once made her uncomfortable. She described a comment Michael made, something about the best time to find someone is when they're alone, and the phrase landed in the courtroom like a cold drop. Defense counsel pushed back hard, suggesting the recollection was misremembered, that 2 decades yield murkier images, and that the witness's memory could have been influenced by news coverage. The judge permitted the testimony but allowed the defense to call attention to recollection issues during closing. Crossing to logistics, prosecution introduced cell tower data, modest but suggestive. Phones in 2001 pinged towers at low fidelity. They did not provide precise GPS, but their patterns can sometimes speak to proximity when paired with billing records. The team showed that a phone linked to Michael's known accounts had tower activity consistent with being in the neighborhood on the night in question, while his repair shop payroll and employee logs suggested he had unrecorded hours that evening, small anomalies the prosecution argued fit the broader pattern. Defense strategy rested on 2 pillars, transfer and reasonable doubt. The defense counsel reminded jurors repeatedly that Daniel lived in the same community, had social interactions with many neighbors, and that DNA can transfer through casual contact. He raised the specter that the pickup might have been in common use, that Emily could have touched the truck earlier, and that the passage of 2 decades created enough uncertainty to resist conviction. He emphasized the absence of a direct eyewitness placing Michael in the truck at the exact time of Emily's death. "We do not have a single living witness who testified. I saw Michael place Emily in that pickup and drive it into the canal," he said with a measured cadence, forcing jurors to consider the burden of proof. That rhetorical push-and-pull continued across multiple witnesses and days. Prosecutors introduced a repair shop ledger showing a previously undocumented repair done on Michael's truck in the weeks after the disappearance. The defense countered with testimony from a coworker who said the shop sometimes made informal repairs not always logged in detail. The prosecution called a neighbor who remembered Michael's presence at the vigil the night Emily vanished. The neighbor's voice cracked as she said, "He was there, he brought coffee and stayed by the family." The defense cross-examined aggressively, pointing to contradictions in location recollections and the natural frailty of two-decade-old memory. One of the more harrowing parts of the trial was when Emily's parents took the stand. The court allowed short portions of their testimony, carefully measured to avoid gratuitous trauma while preserving human plea. Rebecca described plate settings and empty chairs and the ritual of turning on the porch light each night. "We believed," she said with a voice that tightened into a breath, "that if we kept waiting, something would change." Aaron, calmer in public, spoke of the slow erosion of certainty and of the moment they learned of the pickup's recovery. "At first it gave us an answer," he said. "Then the law took it and turned the answer into a trial." Their appearances had an emotional pull that was both human and procedural. Jurors were reminded that their judgment carried the real weight of a family's altered future. Throughout the trial, Detective Marcus Hale sat quietly, portfolio on his lap. In private, he admitted to a journalist that the case weighed on him like many cold cases do, an accumulation of human error and perseverance. He believed in the science, but he also knew that jurors are human. He prepared witnesses for cross-examination by coaching them to speak simply and honestly, not to sound rehearsed. "The defense will try to make our experts sound like merchants of certainty," he told them. "Don't let them do that. Say what you know and what you don't." As closing arguments approached, the courtroom thrummed with low anticipation. The prosecution framed the case as cumulative, DNA, fibers, pattern, and behavior. The defense framed it as a cautionary tale about interpretation and the inherent limits of science when removed from a living narrative. Jurors went into deliberation with all the raw material of science and memory in their hands: graphs, chromatograms, finger marks, and human recollection. The decision they would render would not be about the past in abstract. It would be about whether the assembled evidence crossed the threshold of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. When the jury finally filed back, faces taut with concentration, the room seemed to inhale. The foreperson read the verdict slowly, the syllables falling like measured stones. On the charge of first-degree murder, guilty. The room released a sound that contained a small, accidental gasp from some and a muffled sob from others. Rebecca dropped her head into her hands and let out a breath she hadn't known she'd been holding for 21 years. Aaron simply closed his eyes and pressed his fingers to the photograph. Outside, the town reacted in waves. Some neighbors gathered to discuss whether community trust could be reconfigured to do better next time. Others questioned the justice system's length. Some defensive voices protested at the courthouse gate. For Hale, the verdict was both vindication and a bittersweet end to a long vigil. The trial had been a sharp prism that refracted 2 decades of uncertainty into a legal statement. But in human terms, it meant only a partial remedy, a name assigned, and accountability acknowledged, but emptiness unchanged where Emily's presence had been. The courtroom decisions that followed, sentencing hearings, appeals notices, motions about admissibility, would add technical chapters to the story. But in the public imagination, the verdict accomplished something immediate. It resolved, for now, the primary public question: was the man named in custody the one the evidence implicated? The legal system had said yes. For the Carters, the verdict was corrosive and consoling. justice had at last come, but its arrival was also an official reopening of grief in which every small memory would now be publicly examined. Defense strategy in high-profile cold case trials is often surgical. Pick apart the seams of the prosecution's narrative, exploit the lossiness of memory, and offer alternative scenarios that remain plausible to jurors. Michael Reynolds' legal team, led by an experienced criminal defense attorney named Stephen Carver, executed that strategy with methodical precision. Carver specialized in forensic skepticism. He understood the power of reasonable doubt in jury psychology and structured his case around undermining the prosecution's cumulative story. Carver began by attacking the perceived linchpin, transfer DNA. He called an independent DNA expert, Dr. Helen Strauss, to the stand to explain mechanisms of indirect transfer. Strauss spoke plainly. DNA can be unconsciously left on surfaces through touching a doorknob, then touching a bag, and later being transferred again to a third surface. She mentioned a series of published studies where handlers left trace amounts of DNA after brief contact, and those traces were later detected on unrelated surfaces. In a small town, she told the jury, where people share space, touch, and tools, it is not unusual to find genetic material in unexpected places. Her testimony was meant to plant a seed. The match in the truck could indicate presence but not culpability. The defense also sowed threads of alternative explanation about how the truck might have ended in the canal. Carver argued that the pickup could have been stolen or used by another person, and then later abandoned. He subpoenaed tow yard records and bills to show possible periods when the truck might have changed hands or been stored in locations not accounted for. He presented testimony from a man who claimed he'd used the truck for a few hours in early 2002 while borrowing it from an acquaintance, though his recollection was shaky and his credibility would later be attacked by prosecution witnesses. Carver leveraged the passage of time itself as a weapon. He asked jurors whether they were comfortable convicting a man on data and memory fragmented by 2 decades. One of the defense's most forceful moves was to question the chain of custody bottlenecks from 2001 to 2022. Carver's cross-examination highlighted discrepancies in early evidence logs, misfiled paperwork, and the reality that evidence had traveled between local agencies before being re-examined. His message was simple: any gap could have introduced contamination, and any contamination could undermine the DNA evidence's reliability. He carefully walked the jury through the lab's standard operating procedures, SOPs, showing where deviations had occurred in past cases and invoking well-known legal precedents where unreliable chain of custody led to overturned convictions. Carver also attacked witness reliability, particularly those who had come forward with retrospective accounts of Michael's behavior. He had a psychologist testify about memory distortion and social influence. Dr. Aaron Glass explained that memory is reconstructive. Given media coverage and repeated community speculation, memories can become conflated, merged, or contaminated with others' accounts. The defense used this testimony to undermine the credibility of witnesses whose recollections had grown more detailed after media exposure or prosecution interviews. Carver's tone wasn't accusatory, it was calm and methodical, an appeal to jurors' rational caution. The defense did not leave character unchallenged. Carver brought character witnesses, neighbors who had relied on Michael's assistance, church members he had quietly helped, and a family who said he had tutored kids. Those witnesses painted an image of a helpful, soft-spoken man who had once been a fixture of the block. Carver used their testimony to humanize Michael in the jurors' eyes and to introduce tension between the man who fixed engines and the man accused of violent crime. People can be complicated, one witness said, and mistakes in judgment don't make them monsters. That line aimed at jurors' empathy. At the same time, the prosecution anticipated these moves and layered responses. They presented laboratory audits and third-party confirmations to rebut contamination claims, explaining the chain of custody steps taken upon re-recovery of the truck and how modern sampling was performed in controlled conditions. They introduced a structural timeline showing when the truck could have been in each known location, and cross-referenced that with Michael's known labor records and purchase receipts to narrow opportunities for the alleged theft or secondary use. The prosecution also called rebuttal witnesses to impugn the credibility of those who painted Michael as a benign neighbor, highlighting instances where the same individuals had made inconsistent statements or where their recollection was prompted by recent exposure to news accounts. The defense's legal maneuvers extended to pretrial motions and procedural tactics. Carver filed motions to exclude certain character evidence, arguing that repeated testimonies about Michael's awkwardness were mere reputation-based assertions that prejudiced jurors rather than contributed probative value. The judge, aware of the thin line between character evidence and probative pattern, allowed some testimony and limited other parts, explaining to the jury that certain recollections should be weighed with care and not treated as conclusive proof of guilt. A striking moment in the trial came when Carver pressed the question of motive: why would Michael kill Emily? The prosecution had never argued with flamboyance on motive. Their theory rested on predatory behavior and opportunity more than a clearly articulated argument such as money or revenge. Carver used this to suggest that motive remained speculative. If motive exists, Carver said, the prosecution should lay it bare. The lack of a shouted motive, no documented stalking, no clear threatened escalation, was, in Carver's framing, a missing piece that mattered. Yet prejudice is a fragile argument where evidence accumulates. While the defense offered plausible alternative narratives, the prosecution's presentation of convergent evidence, DNA, fiber patterns, soil matches, and overlapping witness testimony, continued to create a mosaic that in aggregate read as more than the sum of its parts. The prosecution emphasized that while some pieces could be explained away individually, the statistical improbability of all these independent traces aligning by coincidence remained compelling. The jury's psychology, however, is mercurial. Some jurors are more persuaded by the human testimonies, the parent's grief, the deli worker's memory, while others lean toward technical certainty, taking comfort in lab confirmation. Defense counsel sought to split juror sympathy from lab data. The prosecution aimed to fuse them. In the quiet halls between proceedings, jurors conferred amongst themselves during recesses and asked questions about core concepts through clerks, not directly but in ways that signaled where their doubts lay. They wanted simple clarifications. How likely is secondary transfer? How many people had access to the truck historically? Which lab control samples were run? While the defense's doubt campaign was active, they also had to guard against public perception. Local opinion is a force in small communities, and in Phoenix, where relationships are long-standing, neighbors' public voices can influence private juror perceptions. The media played both sides, presenting both prosecutors' assertions and defense counters, sometimes simplifying complex forensic nuance into headlines that stung. Carver used this reality strategically, arguing that the rush of public judgment had prejudiced the community. He demanded a voir dire, a careful juror screening, and ensured that any juror with a demonstrated bias would be excused. In the end, the trial had become a duel of narratives, a mosaic of overlapping forensic and witness evidence versus a carefully constructed web of plausible alternative explanations and caution about memory's fallibility. The jury, forced to reconcile the two, carried the heavy duty of discernment. They returned with a verdict that, to some, confirmed scientific triumph and, to others, validated the power of caution against over-reliance on interpretive evidence. For the defense, the case was a reminder of how forensic techniques have become both a tool of truth and a battleground for interpretation in modern trials. As legal motions and appeals began to unfurl in the months after the verdict, the public debate shifted from immediate courtroom drama to larger questions about forensic reliability, about how communities handle allegations, and about what reforms might prevent long delays in justice. Defense counsel publicly said they would pursue appeals. Prosecutors said the evidence supported the court's outcome. In neighborhoods around Phoenix, people spoke carefully now, aware that their recollections and actions could be subject to legal scrutiny. Through it all, the families affected, Emily's and Michael's, continued to live in a world rearranged by the courtroom's geometry. People who had once waved across fences now greeted one another with new hesitations, and the small-town social fabric found itself rewoven with instructive but painful threads. When the jury returned its verdict, guilty on charges of first-degree murder, the courtroom exhaled. The verdict was decisive, but the emotional response was, as earlier, mixed. For Rebecca Carter, the verdict had a complex feel, validation and sorrow braided together. "It felt like the law finally put a name to what happened to my child," she said in a soft recorded interview. That said, nothing in a courtroom brings her back. Aaron's reaction was quieter, a steady, focused grief that turned toward action. He became involved with missing persons outreach and began advocating for community protocols that could prevent silence from creating cover. The judge scheduled sentencing after a victim impact hearing. Those hearings are a stage where law and emotion openly intersect. Family members spoke, sometimes through tears, about the subtle and persistent absence Emily's death had created. "Her laughter is absent from our home," Rebecca said. "We have kept vigil for 21 years. Today, we ask that the punishment reflect what was taken." The prosecutor recommended a sentence in the highest range due to the premeditation suggested by the pattern evidence and the lengthy time Emily's family had spent without an answer. Psychological testimony entered the sentencing phase. The defense proffered a clinical psychologist who described Michael as socially awkward and possibly having borderline personality features, but argued that these were not determinative of homicidal intent. The prosecution countered with a behavioral analyst, someone who had studied predatory patterns, who provided a clinical portrait of a manipulative opportunist, a person who ingratiates himself into a community, leverages neighborly trust, and uses routine interactions as camouflage for predatory tendencies. This clinical portrait was not presented to sensationalize violence but to explain behavior in ways the jury and public could process. The analyst emphasized subtle markers of predatory planning, increased proximity to a vulnerable person, small invasions of privacy normalized by helpful behavior, and behavioral persistence despite rejection. These markers do not constitute proof alone but serve as context when paired with physical evidence. The analyst stressed that many people are awkward without being dangerous. The key difference lies in escalation and exploitation of opportunity. Sentencing was severe. Given the nature of the crime, the loss involved, and aggravating factors, particularly the duplicitous community engagement that prolonged the family's uncertainty, the judge imposed a lengthy term that amounted to decades behind bars. The sentence aimed to balance punishment, deterrence, and the public's need for formal censure. Michael's attorney vowed appeals based on procedural grounds and the chain of custody claims raised in trial. Community reaction to sentencing was deeply split. Some neighbors attended the hearing to see the conclusion of years of speculation. Other residents avoided courtrooms and media entirely, unable to bear the reopening of wounds. Posters of Emily appeared at memorial sites and at civic gatherings. Support groups formed for families of missing persons. Churches and community centers organized talks about recognizing boundary violations and the importance of listening to people who report harassment. Meanwhile, psychologists and criminologists weighed in publicly. Dr. Jennifer Morales, a forensic psychologist interviewed on local news, framed Michael's behavior in socio-psychological terms. She discussed how small-town dynamics can obscure predatory behavior because social cohesion often assumes goodwill. Communities are sometimes structured to give the benefit of the doubt to those who fit in, she said. That generosity can be exploited. Her interview resonated because it morphed an individual case into a structural lesson. Neighborly goodwill needs to be balanced with attentive scrutiny when people report discomfort. At criminology conferences, the case became a teaching example in courses on cold case investigation and victim advocacy. Forensic labs highlighted the advances in DNA recovery and next-generation sequencing that made this case solvable. Law enforcement agencies re-examined their practice manuals and considered policy reforms, standardized collection of evidence from missing person searches, more rigorous handling of chain-of-custody documentation, and protocols for preserving potential burial or sunken site evidence. Michael's appeal process highlighted the friction between scientific confidence and legal precision. Appellate lawyers argued procedural flaws and asked for re-evaluation of certain evidentiary decisions. The appellate court reviewed the record and the lower court's adherence to legal standards. Appeals are often lengthy, technical affairs removed from daily life, but in this case they posed the potential to unsettle a family finally able to name the person responsible. While the legal system proceeded with procedural machinery, families sought closure in other ritual forms. The Carters arranged a small, private memorial that was more about acceptance than triumph. A bench was installed in a park with a plaque that read Emily's name, her smile captured in a small metal etching. The family organized community outreach programs focused on listening skills for teachers and clergy and established a support fund for families whose missing person cases remain open. Those tools turned their private grief into community action. Media retrospectives summed the case as both a triumph of forensic persistence and a cautionary tale about community myopia. News segments focused on how human kindness had been weaponized, how acts of help had shielded predator behavior. They also emphasized the role of technological change, DNA methods, better microscopy for fiber comparison, and improved soil signature analysis had, together, allowed a 2-decade-old mystery to be resolved in a court of law. The sentencing did not end the family's grief, nor did it settle all debates in town. Some people privately questioned whether a decades-long sentence adequately accounted for the human cost. Others argued that punishment could never be proportional to their loss. Courts can return a verdict, they cannot return a presence. That fundamental limitation of law would be a recurring theme in public and scholarly conversations about the case. In prison, Michael participated in psychological assessments and therapy programs typical of the correctional setting. These records, part of the public file in some jurisdictions, showed a man who alternated between defensive silence and intermittent, remorseful statements. Some psychologists reading those interviews concluded that his outward social helpfulness was a mask, a performative integration into community life. Others pointed out that such generalized conclusions risk simplifying complex psychological states. The truth, like most legal truths, remained partially in evidence and partially in interpretation. In the months that followed sentencing, the case took on a life as both a localized sorrow and a national lesson. Families with missing loved ones reached out to Rebecca and Aaron, wanting to know how they sustained hope for so long. Rebecca, with a humility born of loss, said, "You do one small thing every day, you keep remembering." Their advice emphasized persistence, record-keeping, and the need to keep public pressure on cases because science, too, may move forward and make evidence speak. In the end, sentencing produced a legally binding consequence, a societal statement about culpability, and a measure of moral reckoning. It also reinforced the limits of law vis-a-vis grief. No sentencing can restore a life. Still, for some families, a conviction provides a narrative closure necessary to heal. For others it opens a new chapter in activism and prevention. The Carters chose the latter, transforming private ache into public service. The aftermath of a high-profile cold case resolution is often a season of reflection, institutional review, and social reform. In Phoenix and surrounding neighborhoods, the Emily Carter case catalyzed a series of changes, some procedural, some cultural, that would alter how local law enforcement, institutions, and citizens approached missing person reports. Law enforcement moved quickly to audit internal cold case protocols. The county sheriff's office convened a task force to examine evidence handling standards across agencies. The report recommended a standardization of evidence preservation procedures, particularly in joint investigations that involve municipal and county agencies, to ensure that artifacts recovered in older cases don't suffer from chain of custody vulnerabilities. The sheriff's office also initiated enhanced training for evidence technicians on degraded DNA extraction, touch DNA protocols, and the proper documentation of collection environments, noting that even a small lapse in early handling can generate months of legal disputes. Forensics labs, both locally and nationally, used the case in training seminars to demonstrate the value of next-generation sequencing in degraded sample contexts. The lab that handled the Carter sample published a peer-reviewed case study, with names redacted, showing methods and control steps that can salvage useful profiles from samples once considered hopeless. That publication advanced professional dialogue, prompting other labs to adopt similar protocols to ensure high standards and replicability. Beyond technical reforms, the case stirred civic discussions about community responsibilities. Local neighborhood associations adopted watch and listen policies emphasizing taking complaints seriously. Churches and community centers instituted listening protocols that trained staff on how to respond non-judgmentally when someone reported boundary violations. Schools included sessions on recognizing grooming and predatory behavior in age-appropriate curricula. These efforts attempted to recalibrate a cultural tendency to dismiss awkwardness as harmless and to encourage attentive responses when people report discomfort. For the Carters, the practical work of memory turned outward. They established the Emily Carter Legacy Fund, which offers grants to families with missing loved ones to pay for DNA testing, private search costs, or public awareness campaigns. Through this fund, families can access forensic expertise that might otherwise be financially out of reach. The fund also sponsors seminars for law enforcement on family liaison best practices. Rebecca became a reluctant public figure at victim advocacy conferences, using her voice to counsel patients and persistence to others caught in similar limbo. The case also highlighted the importance of technology in both positive and problematic ways. Social media had circulated rumors and at times exaggerated claims that complicated the lives of witnesses. Law enforcement and community leaders urged caution about amateur sleuthing that might contaminate evidence or intimidate witnesses. At the same time, modern privacy-protecting genealogical techniques were praised for their role in enabling matches through distant relatives, a tool that, properly regulated, can close cases. Advocacy groups lobbied for balanced policies that protect privacy while allowing investigative uses of genetic genealogy under clear legal oversight. Psychological services expanded in the community. The constant reopening of grief had shown the need for long-term counseling for families in cold case situations. Clinics offered sliding scale services, and volunteer counselors trained specifically in long-term ambiguous loss trauma were in higher demand. Rebecca and Aaron both attended therapy groups where other parents shared stories of waiting wounds and slow grief rituals that demand more resilience than acute bereavement. Media analysis of the case also matured. Journalists and documentary producers expressed regret over early sensationalism in some coverage and committed to more sensitive reporting on missing person cases going forward. Ethical guidelines were revised in some local outlets to avoid speculative headlines that can force families into additional public trauma. Documentary filmmakers, aware of the ethical lines to navigate, sought consent from families and worked with victim advocates to ensure storytelling centered dignity and factual accuracy over sensational detail. Legal scholars weighed in with policy papers. One proposed reform suggested legally mandated evidence preservation protocols for all active missing person searches, requiring agencies to treat associated items as potential long-term evidence rather than ephemeral debris. Another recommended that when a missing person case is closed as a cold file, it should be reviewed every 5 years with the option for new forensic testing if technology advanced, a proposal aimed at preventing decades-long dormancy. The Carters' personal life, while forever altered, took on a new pattern of meaning. They established rituals to honor Emily's memory that were more celebratory than sorrowful: community garden plantings, an annual scholarship in her name for nursing students, and a small scholarship fund that supported local high school seniors who pledged community service. These acts changed how neighbors commemorated Emily, transforming private loss into public contribution. Meanwhile, the conviction and sentencing of Michael Reynolds did not mark a final closure. Appeals and legal filings continued. Defense counsel pursued procedural arguments and requested post-conviction reviews. The appellate process consumed months of court attention and kept the case in legal rotation, though the public's consumption of the story waned as new headlines emerged. For the Carters, this was expected news. Criminal justice often unfolds in iterative stages after trial, and families must endure the additional stress of procedural uncertainty. Psychologists who studied the case described a dual lesson, one about individuals and one about systems. Individually, predatory behavior is often incremental and predicated on misused proximity, people who exploit trust, assistance, and small opportunities. Systemically, communities and institutions must create responsive practices that do not rely solely on single dramatic reports but sustain attentiveness to patterns of harmless-seeming behavior that may conceal harm. That insight shaped local programming aimed at early intervention. As seasons passed, the Carters moved intentionally. They attended the community programs they helped create, spoke publicly about the slow arc of their case, and met other parents who had not yet found their answers. The community, segmented by opinions during the trial, began to talk more reflexively about responsibilities to one another. A cultural shift, subtle, not revolutionary, had been seeded, a new willingness to listen and an increased desire to scrutinize behavior that previously had been normalized as just how people are. In the local schools, teachers incorporated discussions about consent and personal boundaries into age-appropriate materials. Police departments partnered with schools to discuss reporting options that do not require immediate criminal accusations, making it easier for young people to flag discomfort before it escalates. Those programs, while modest, were tangible changes that aimed to reduce the conditions that allowed predator behavior to go unchallenged for decades. While the story's public heat cooled, persistent processes remained, the Carters tending their memorials, the advocacy work continuing, labs adopting improved protocols, and neighboring families learning to speak up. Collective memory had shifted. The case became a local cautionary tale and a professional exemplar, showing both how justice can arrive late and how communities can adapt to prevent future silence. Closure is a complicated word. It suggests an endpoint, a neat somersault that lands on the feet. For families who have lived with a missing loved one for years, closure, if it exists at all, is subtle, partial, and often a pragmatic reshaping of life rather than a final event. For Rebecca and Aaron Carter, the legal conclusion, conviction, sentencing, and procedural appeals offered a degree of accountability. But it did not erase the years of silence nor the daily reality that Emily's presence was now a memory rather than a shared household. In the months and years following trial, life settled into a new rhythm. The porch light that had burned for 21 years remained a small ritual, now a symbol of both remembrance and a promise to act. The community vigils remained, but their tone shifted from anxious hope to a mixed celebration and caution, honoring a life lost while committing to new vigilance. Rebecca spoke at schools about listening to young people, and Aaron ran workshops for neighborhood groups about record-keeping and evidence reporting. Their grief had been transformed into a purposeful public practice. For Detective Marcus Hale and the cold case team, the case remained one among many, but it also shaped their careers. Departments across the state asked for briefings on how their team combined scientific advancements with meticulous re-interviewing to close the case. Hale emphasized process over glory. "We didn't solve this because of a single technique," he told an audience at a forensic conference. "We solved it because we combined better science with better listening, and because a family never let the file go cold." That simple summation underlined the mixed nature of the success. Michael Reynolds' psychological profile, developed through prison assessments and interviews, fed into a continuing debate about the nature of predation and prevention. Psychologists described what they called relational predation, exploiting routine social interactions for illicit ends. They proposed that communities adopt low-cost structural protections, clear sign-in and sign-out policies for volunteers involved in family assistance programs, better training for clergy and youth leaders in boundary recognition, and community campaigns encouraging bystander intervention. Such measures were practical, targeted, and scalable, designed less for fear-mongering than for empowering citizens. The court of public opinion, once feverish, had mellowed. Some neighbors who had supported Michael publicly apologized to the Carters for doubting them. Others remained quietly defensive for reasons that were complex and often personal. The town's social fabric, though tested, adapted. New norms emerged, neighbors exchanged phone numbers more regularly, and community groups organized safety monitors for late-night events, reducing the reliance on single individuals' trustworthiness. At the academic level, several journals published reflections on the case, law reviews focused on evidentiary developments, forensic science journals discussed methodological innovations, and sociologists analyzed community dynamics that allowed suspicion to be deflected. The result was a broad, multidisciplinary conversation that attempted to pull practical reform from painful lessons. Rehabilitation and accountability debates continued in the background. Some argued for restorative practices that would engage offenders in community repair, an idea controversial in violent crime cases. Others insisted on the necessity of incarceration for public safety. The Carters leaned toward the latter for their own sense of security, yet Rebecca occasionally expressed ambivalence. "I don't want to see him living his life," she said in one thoughtful interview. "But I also don't want the system to be a place where punishment is the only story. I want people to be safer." That tension reflected a broader societal question: what balance of punishment, rehabilitation, and prevention best serves justice and community health? The legal appeals moved through their steps, ultimately affirming the conviction after a careful procedural review. Appellate courts upheld the trial court's evidentiary rulings and the reliability of the lab protocols in question. Defense counsel continued to advocate in public about the risk of overconfidence in modern forensic methods. Such debates are not simply about one case's outcome but about shaping standards for future proceedings. In the quieter moments, Rebecca found ways to keep Emily present that were less about justice and more about memory. She started a small scholarship in Emily's name for nursing students, an idea that honored her daughter's aspirations and connected a personal loss to a public good. Aaron remained active in Community Watch and created an archive for missing persons cases, cataloging documents so future investigators could find traces that might otherwise be lost. Their practical rituals, scholarships, memorials, archives, turned pain into forward motion. The Emily Carter case became a narrative with multiple endings: legal closure, institutional reform, community change, and personal healing. Each is partial, each is ongoing. For some families, the case remains a beacon of hope that persistence and scientific progress can, someday, reconnect them with answers. For investigators, it's a reminder that a case is never just file upon file but a network of human relationships and technical processes that must be managed with care. One lingering, important question remained for the community and for anyone who followed the case deeply: how do societies balance the social value of neighborly trust with the need for vigilance against those who exploit that trust? It's a question without a simple answer because human relationships depend on openness, yet safety depends on boundaries. The practical path forward lies in modest institutional reforms, better forensic readiness, and cultural shifts that encourage taking complaints seriously, without immediately criminalizing innocent behavior. As the sun set over Phoenix on the anniversary of Emily's burial, people gathered at the small park where a bench had been placed in her honor. The bench carried an inscription that read, simply, "Remembering Emily Carter, always." Candles burned. A brief speech emphasized not only memory but responsibility, a call to listen, to document, and to act. It was a small public ritual, but a meaningful one. For Rebecca and Aaron, such rituals made room for grief and meaning simultaneously. The community's reckoning was not a dramatic epiphany but a slow adaptation. People changed how they let strangers into their lives, how they responded to discomfort, and how they preserved evidence, both material and testimonial, over time. The case's legacy was therefore practical: better lab protocols, more attentive communities, improved training for professionals, and, for a handful of families, an answer that allowed a small measure of peace. As the final credits of this story roll in your mind, there is one question we'd like to leave you with, a question that matters not just for this case, but for every community that hopes to protect its most vulnerable. When someone says, "I felt uneasy," do we believe them enough to act, investigate, and preserve the trace they offer? Thank you for joining us on this journey to uncover the truth of Phoenix, 2001. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to subscribe to catch our next cases. See you in the next video where we'll keep seeking justice hidden behind secrets thought buried forever.